Hello there, model kit fans. This is Jim, and we're now beginning part 2 of the F-80 series of U.S. fighters in 1/144th scale. So I'm going to take the camera now and move it over to look rather closely at one of my favorite planes, the McDonnell XF-85 Goblin. Now, McDonald built 2 of these planes, but that's not the reason why there are 2 pictured here. So, in 2003, I built this one here that you see out of pine, or actually pine and balsa. And you can see the wood grain there if you look really closely at the camera. And I'm really pleased, not to brag, but I'm really pleased about how that turned out. So my carving skills were getting a little bit better. And I vacuum formed that canopy. I was never able to really successfully do that on any other planes. But at any rate, I built the Goblin pretty much based on the Lloyd Jones book that I had. And I also scratch built the little trolley there. And then got proper paint scheme and so forth, and then I added that to my collection. 5 years later, in 2008, my wife bought me the 1/144th scale B-36 made by Hobbycraft, and it came with not only a Goblin but also an RF-84F Ficon. So that's why we have this one. And had I known that there was going to be a difference in tail numbers, that was the only tail number that came with it, I would have changed the tail number. But you notice that that dolly happens to be yellow. Okay, you'll hear our little cat there meowing in the back. The Goblin made by McDonald was a result of the Air Force looking for a escort fighter that could be carried along inside a bomber, say the B-36 or the B-29, and would have a trapeze that would drop down. This is in the taking a picture of the Lloyd Jones book here. You can see down at the bottom there is the XF-85 dangling on the trapeze from the B-29. And it was a great idea at the time in 1948 when it flew, but it just never worked out. The Goblin could drop down fairly easily and detach, but it was very difficult due to the vortex created by and turbulence created by the B-29 to hook back up again. And they even tried it with the RF-84F, which I will show you in the next video, and which is the F-95, and it didn't really work out there. And coincidentally, about the same time, missiles were coming out, and it just, well, it took over. It was just a better idea. And so the idea of the parasite fighter just died. But you can see how tiny that is. It had a wingspan literally of 14 feet. And when you compare that with the ruler here, it's little more than, it's under 2 inches long. So, but it's just a unique plane in and of itself. And one crashed, and there's one in existence at the U.S. Air Force Museum at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base. Now, the book that I have here that I used is a photo-detailed essay of the XF-85 Goblin by Steve Muth, and it's produced by Penegrine Publishing out of New York, copyright of 2000. It's got some beautiful photos inside that of the plane itself, especially if you want to do some highly detailed. During the 1980s, there was a 1/144th scale, or 1/72nd scale, pardon me, vacuum form kit that was produced that I had built when I was a teenager. Now, continuing on, we have the Trumpeter model of the F-86F, which was our answer in Korea to the MiG-15. See, we were just getting beat by the MiG-15 with our piston-powered planes and even the straight-winged F-80. And North American came up with the F-86, a swept-wing version. The Trumpeter model is really highly detailed. It's a beautifully done kit. And it has the air brakes that extend, and you look in the underside, and there we have some just nice bright decals. And it had a refueling pod here, or an arm there that broke off sometime during the years, but anyway, just a beautifully done plane. Even the canopy, even inside the cockpit's really highly detailed. Now you may be wondering, how did I get that metallic finish on this plane to where you can almost see my reflection? And so I want to take a moment to talk about Alclad Paints. They're a lacquer. So I'm going to move the camera again back over to the planes, and you'll see there, this is a Model Master, which Testers is now out of the business, but the metallizer, as opposed to the metallic color that's used here on the XF-85 Goblin and the F-86. And so this right here is the what I use, and this is Alclad polished aluminum lacquer. And the process that you need to do with your airbrush is turn it down to 20 psi. After you've laid down a gloss coat of either black, or you can even use white. So like this black with the XF-87 would be a great layer. Make sure it's gloss black, nice solid clear coat. Let it harden. You can use enamel, you can use acrylic, doesn't really matter what you're using. You can use Alclads if you want. I find that the Tamiya acrylic works really beautifully to really bring the luster out of this. And then you turn this down to the airbrush down to 20 psi and just start to work in slowly and layer in the lacquer. Lacquer dries really quickly, and I think you'll find that you'll get some beautiful results. Sometimes I can get almost a totally chrome looking polish with that polished aluminum. Better than I can say with the chrome. Well, the next plane on the agenda was the last plane that I built in 2010, 2011, somewhere in there. And that was the Curtiss XP-87 or the XF-87. This was Curtiss's last plane that they ever produced. After that, they quit producing. They went to producing other things like engines and such. I built this using a clear acrylic body. You can see the canopy it really came out nicely, and then it has styrene plastic wings and tail. The engines are also out of acrylic. Those were rather challenging to carve, I will say that. The decals happen to be done using an Alps printer, and by a friend that I had met through, I think John Haverstock is the guy who did it. He's a 1/144 scale builder. And then, of course, the other decals are just stuff that I had on hand that were the right shape. And unfortunately, this fighter did not do much for Curtiss. It was competing against the F-89, and the government chose to use the F-89 instead. Now, back up just a bit. The book that I use for the F-86, I have a couple of, and the couple of books on that. Actually, I just have one, I guess. And that's of course the Squadron signal book here on the F-86. It's a really neat book, and it's got some great artwork inside and photographs on the development. So, looking at the McDonnell XF-88 Voodoo. Another Steve Ginter publications that I used as a reference material. Again, nicely done. There are several versions of the XF-88 that McDonald produced, and you have a great modeling section at the back if you're interested in looking at that, both in vacuum form and injection molded. The kit that you see built here is one that I scratch built, and it's using a clear acrylic body. The canopy was carved separately. The wings were actually made out of styrene plastic. One was, and the other one is resin. So it was my first job of casting in resin. So I made an RTV mold of this wing. So I wanted an exact duplicate of the other, and then cast the other one using resin that I picked up at a local hobby store. And anyway, I think it turned out pretty decently. Of course, there's no panel lines and so forth. I made the decals myself using my inkjet printer. Now, to show you kind of the process of how this goes about, I carve it out of clear acrylic. Here's the first test fuselage of it that didn't quite work out the way I had planned. And even I'd gouged it a little bit there, so I tried filling it in with styrene plastic. It just wasn't carving uniform, and I was losing dimensions, so I redid it again a second time. The final plane happens to be the F-89. Now, I built this plane in 2005. This was another of Don's models, Don's resin models. It did not come with the missiles there. That was something that I added and carved into the bays or the wing pods. But Don's did come with those wing pods as well as underneath those tanks there. Don does a beautiful job of sculpting his models, and I decided to paint this according to what they would have had in Alaska. So this would have been one of those Arctic paint schemes. Now, some reference materials that I used for that were a couple of them. You can see here from the Squadron book, there we have the paint scheme that I used. And the back side, it shows another Arctic version of the Northrop F-89 Scorpion. And then, of course, what would have been interesting would have been the all-black version. I kind of think that's pretty unique. And we have just all sorts of colored versions inside that book. The other reference material that I have is another Squadron book, The In Detail by Bert Kinzey. And this one here, I've referred to his books before. Again, a little more detailed for the modeler that wants some more color photos rather than paintings, and some drawings and some details inside the cockpit. So if you want more stuff, if you're building a larger scale plane than what I was doing here, this would be the book for you. Well, I hope you enjoyed the video. Please give it a thumbs up if you did, and we'll look forward to seeing you in the F-90 series.